to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today we're going to talk about Native Americans. I don't think we've done that on the Two Tongues Podcast. I don't think I've done that in my little solo shows here yet. But listen, we live in the United States, and part of the world that's thick with rich cultural heritage of the people who lived here before Europeans, and they've got some really interesting things to say on the topic of religion and God and psychology and many of the things that I enjoy. So I'm going to bring some of that to you today. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Omaha tribe. And even more specifically still, we're going to talk about how the Omaha imagined God. Now, you notice how I say that. I'm not saying how the Omaha understood spirits or gods. You might think that Indian tribes were polytheistic, and you may say that that's true. There's an argument that they're solidly henotheistic, that they maybe even are some sort of a primitive monotheistic group in general. I realize we're grouping lots of Native people together when we say that, but it's certainly the case in North America, almost from shore to shore, essentially. So we're going to talk about the Omaha today, specifically about the Omaha's God. There's a lot of material that I was able to piece together. It's not super easy when it comes to historical evidence of the religion of Native people, because they didn't write anything down themselves, with the exception of the Maya, the Inca, some of the folks that had writing systems, of course. But it's certainly not common in North America, where I live and where the Omaha are from. In fact, the Omaha originate in the same state where I live and was born and raised, in the southern part of Ohio. I wasn't from the southern part of the state, but I feel some connection to the tribe for that reason. They eventually moved further west, and they live in Nebraska and Iowa today, primarily. But they're related to the greater tribal groups that speak Siouan languages, the Sioux tribe, the Lakota, some of those folks that live even further west. So we'll get into some of that here today. Let's see, where do I want to begin? Let's just start by talking about, well, I guess maybe I'll take a step back just to remind you. You may have caught this reference to the Omaha religion when we were doing our episode on The Origin of the World's Religions, that book that was written by Michael Witzel. And there was basically one sentence about the Omaha's creation story. And it blew me away. It was the inspiration for this podcast today. So there is a book. It's called, I think, The Omaha Tribe, or maybe just called The Omaha, written by two authors, Fletcher and LaFleche. LaFleche, it turns out, was an Omaha Indian himself. This book goes back sometime. It's a lot of these ethnologists and anthropologists in the early days that were recording the history of the Native people. A lot of that stuff goes back to the late 1700s, early and mid 1800s. So this goes back, to that sort of ballpark. And from that source, this is kind of where a lot of this is going to come from today. It was published in 1911, this particular book. All right, so the name that the Omaha used for God is Wakande. It's spelled differently in different places. It might look like Wakanda or Wakanda. It seems to be pronounced Wakande. The name Wakande seems to imply a couple of words: power and mystery, something like that. LaFleche says power and mystery or wonder. And there are related words in the Omaha language that give us some idea. So wakandi is a word that means putting forth strength. And wakandagi is a word that's applied to mysterious things, mysterious animals, unexpected things that are mysterious. So you have some roots shared in common with wakande, with God. And those words have connotations to do with strength and mystery. And so Fletcher and LaFleche say, hence we can translate Wakande as the wonderful or mysterious power. So imagine referring to God as the wonderful power or the mysterious power. And again, I want to emphasize here that what we're talking about is God with a capital G. We're talking about something that would be familiar to Jews and Christians and Muslims and Zoroastrians and people that believe in a monotheistic God or even a high God. And this is, I hate to go too far off the beaten path here, but there was a guy, his name was Wilhelm Schmidt. He was an ethnologist in the 1800s. He was a Catholic priest, but he studied the native religions of North America. He wrote extensively about it. And one of the things that he said is that, I think he wrote a book, it was called The High Gods of North America. And he's describing how the Native American people, many of them, in fact, a large portion of them, have a really well-defined idea in their religious hierarchy. Certainly they believe in spirits. The world is imbued by spirits. And many ethnologists will say tribal people who believe that human beings, animals in the world are imbued by spirits, they're animists. Their religion is animism. It's the worship of spirits. And that's not really the case. And you can see that when the Native American people reference the Great Spirit. What is the Great Spirit? If everything is just spirit, what is this Great Spirit? See, this is what I mean by a high God. So you can have all kinds of other gods, and the native peoples did. Often there's a trickster type character, something that would remind you of characters like Loki from the Norse religion. Usually it's coyote. It's some animal that's sly and cunning. And in their folk tales, these animals they sort of play a role like the devil. They're tempting you. They're making fun of you. They're putting obstacles in your way, in the hero's way, that kind of thing. So there are other deities involved: the sun, animals, the moon. There's all kinds of things that are attached to divinity in the Native American world. But in every case, something stands at the top of that hierarchy, and it's always only one, right? This is the high God. This is the great God. And we understand that. Even in the Western world and in our ancient religious traditions, there's always a high God. Zeus is the king of the gods, if you kind of put it that way. And in Hinduism, you have Brahma as the high God, and all the other gods fall underneath, this pyramid underneath him. And this is how you can think about the Native American religion. But the question comes up, how is it that they understand the high God? Is the high God one of many? Or are all of the other divinities, all the other spiritual beings that they are recognized, are they somehow an emanation from the high God? Are they part of the high God? Do they roll up into the high God? And if they do, then you can argue, and you can make the same argument with Hinduism, a religion that has thousands and thousands of deities. You can argue that it's monotheistic. This is a group of people who worship one God, and they understand that there is a cascading hierarchy downward of properties, characteristics, or pieces of that one high God. And you can give them different names and tell different stories about them. And we see that with the ancient Greeks. Apollo and Demeter and Dionysus and all these gods have their own stories and so forth. But the question is, can we really distinguish them from Zeus? Is Zeus really the high God, and all of these other gods are expressions of Zeus in some way? That's certainly a more compelling argument when we're talking about Hinduism, but that seems to be the case here as well. And lots of people, I'm certainly not the first, lots of people have said that makes these native peoples, the tribal peoples, in fact, similarly in Australia and in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, similarly there as well. The argument can be made that the primitive religion is some form of a monotheism. It's a matter of interpretation. Polytheism, monotheism, we could go either way here. But this idea of a great spirit, it's very difficult to ignore that in terms of monotheism. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Lakota tribes, because their word for the great spirit is similar. They're linguistically related to the Omaha. So let me give you another piece from Fletcher and LaFleche. It goes like this. In Lakota spirituality, Wakan Tanka is the term for the sacred or the divine. So Wakan means like holy or sacred, something like that. He said, this is usually translated as the Great Spirit, and occasionally as the great mystery. It's interpreted as the sacredness that resides in everything, resembling some animistic or pantheistic beliefs. The term describes every creature and object as Wakan, as holy. Okay, let me just take a step back here. So what the Lakota are saying here is this word they use for God, Wakan Tanka. There's something about that that exists in everything. It exists in you and I. It exists in the animals, the living things, in the earth and the heavens. There's something that we associate with the Great Spirit that's in everything. And it makes all of the world and everything in it holy. All of the cosmos. Something about that makes them holy. It's this idea that is not dissimilar even from Christianity with the right interpretation, where when God in the Bible is creating mankind, he breathes his own spirit into the clay form of Adam, and that brings it to life. So the life and the existence of Adam is identical to the life of God. He's sharing it with this representation, with this man, Adam, but it's the same soul and life that is in God that is now in the human being. And so the Sioux seem to see something like this. There's some part of God that's in everything. Okay. And it makes everything holy. And it's interesting psychologically, sociologically, and politically. Like, how different would you treat people? How differently would you govern a nation if everybody believed that? And he says that it reminds you of animism, which we talked about a minute ago, or pantheism, which is this idea that everything is God. That's what it means. Pan means all, and theist means God. So everything is God. The cosmos is God in a sense. And you can understand that if everything is imbued with God and everything is holy, it's really just a matter of degree, whether you say it's pantheist or not. All right, so let me just diverge from Fletcher and LaFleche for a second. There was a book called North American Indians of the Plains, published in 1920 by a guy named Clark Whistler. And he kind of continues on the same subject about the Lakota high god. He says the Dakota use a term, Wakan Tanka. It's like the Omaha Wakonda, or Wakande. And it seems to mean the great sacred ones. So Clark Whistler is in a sense framing this as polytheistic, right? The great sacred ones. Now it's hard to really understand that, because you might interpret that to mean they're recognizing many gods, or you might take that to have something related to that Wonkin idea we just talked about, that everything has a little bit of God in it. So the sacred ones are just sort of could just be a way of looking at reality. All the things in it are sacred. The sacred ones, and that there's a philosophical argument, an ancient one that connects to this. It's the argument of the one and the many. So I won't harp on that, but let me continue. Whistler says, the Dakota recognize a kind of hierarchy in which the sun stands first as one of the Wakan Tanka. Of almost equal rank is the sky, the earth, and the rock. Next is the moon, considered to be a goddess. Winged one is another god. The wind as a deity, and something called the mediator, which is also a goddess. Then comes inferior beings like the buffalo, the bear, the four winds. These are all natural elements that have some divine component to them in many or most Native American populations. So he's describing a hierarchy where the sun is on top and all of these other deities fall below it, all of which are considered Wakan Tanka. So here you have some idea that's different from what we just talked about, this high God scenario. But is it so different? If we take the sun and all of these other deities that fall down below this as one thing, and we recognize the unity there, the Wakan, the holy, the unity that the divinity that unifies them. If we consider that thing, that's one thing. It's just a really short step from there to a high God or a monotheism. So some interesting difference there. So now I just want to jump into kind of what brought my attention to the Omaha tribe and their religion. This is that reference I mentioned in that book by Witzel, but it happens to also come from Fletcher in the Flesh, that book, The Omaha Tribe, from 1911, and it sort of attempts to give us a Genesis account of the Omaha people, their creation story. And I don't know how skewed by pop culture this is, but I just imagine the native elders sitting around the campfire talking to the younglings. Maybe they're smoking their pipe, they're blowing smoke, and they're telling the legends to the young people around the fire. This is the image I have. And this is what they say. At the beginning, all things were in the mind of Wakonda. All creatures, including man, were spirits. They moved about in space between the earth and the stars. They were seeking a place where they could come into a bodily existence. Then they descended to the earth. They saw it was covered with water. They floated through the air and found no dry land. They were sorely grieved. Suddenly, from the midst of the waters, arose a great rock. It burst into flames, and waters floated into the air in clouds. A dry land appeared, and the grasses grew, and the trees grew. The hosts of spirits descended and became flesh and blood. And the land vibrated with the expression of joy and gratitude to Wakonda, the maker of all things. Beautiful. Beautiful as far as I'm concerned. And you can see certain similarities to the Christian creation story. There are others that I can kind of identify just on first glance. So we can talk through some of this a little bit. But what I want to say here is, in the beginning, sort of how it begins is reminiscent of Genesis. I love that. But this is the line that got my attention. In the beginning, all things were in the mind of Wakonda. Right? So reality exists in the mind of God. And then it says this, all creatures, including men, were spirits. So in the time before these beings were manifest, they were spirits existing in the mind of God. And then it gets even stranger. It says, they moved about in space between the earth and the stars. Okay, so what that means is that the earth and the stars also exist in the mind of Wakonda, right? If men are spirits, everything is in the mind of God, and these spirits are floating around trying to figure out how do they become manifest, and they're there with the earth and the stars. They're floating around in space. Space is, and this has come up many, many times with mystical authors, space is considered to be identical. Outer space is considered to be identical to the space of your closed eyes, the space of imagination. So you close your eyes and the darkness that you see is infinite. And that is identical to outer space. The objects of your thoughts that come to fill the darkness when you think of an idea or an object is exactly like the stars and planets and galaxies and things floating in outer space. It is a world of mind. Okay, then it says, then they descended to earth. And there's all sorts of images of me. I can see stories from the Bible where angels descend upon the earth, like we see in Genesis, or from the Zoroastrians where the angels and demons descend upon the earth. I get this image of these spirits coming down to the earth to become embodied. And it says when they get there, the world is covered with water. And they're floating around looking for some place to land, and they can't. There's no place. It's all water. And you know why I think this is interesting. If you listen to this podcast, you know that water is a symbol of the unconscious. If everything exists in the mind of God, and these spirits try to become manifest, and they come down and they see nothing but the unconscious. The unconscious it's very close to a synonym for God as far as I'm concerned. But they have no place to land. And there's a parallel here to Judeo-Christian religion as well, and it's tied to ancient Babylonian religion, is that the church, the temple, is a place where the gods can come to rest. That's how it's described. It's a place where the gods can come to rest. And human beings are even seen in that light biblically, right? When the breath of God, the Spirit of God is breathed into Adam, the body then becomes a place for God to rest. And we have related phrases from the Bible about the body being the temple of God. That's what this means, a place where the Spirit comes to rest. And this is what we see in the Wakonda story, or in the Omaha story. Spirits have no place to rest. They need something to be embodied, something to be anchored in, right? And this is when a great rock comes up from the ocean, and it's on fire, and it sort of cooks away some of the water so that dry lands can appear. And we see this everywhere. We see this sort of cosmic egg idea. We see this idea of, in ancient Japan, of the ground being literally fished up. A harpoon is thrown it by, and down into the ocean, and the ground is the islands of Japan are pulled up by Izanami and Izagami, the primordial, founders of Japan. And that's how the earth is formed. And there's similar myths, the earth diver myth, which we see in Asia, and we see in the Native American populations where the earth needs to be found in the beginning. The beginning is all water, and the earth needs to be brought up from the ocean. And this is what we see in the Omaha story. And then everything flourishes, the grasses and the trees grow, the spirits are able to find a place to rest, and then they become flesh and blood, then they become incarnate. And the land vibrates with joy, it says, and gratitude to God, the maker of all things. It reminds me of the Bible saying, and God said that it was good. All right, so Fletcher and LaFleche continue. They say, an invisible and continuous life was believed to permeate all things, seen and unseen. So there's this eternal life force that the Omaha believe. It permeates all things, and it's associated with God, with Wakanda. It says this life manifests itself in two ways. First, by causing all motion. All actions of mind or body are because of this invisible life. Second, by causing permanency of structure and form, as in the rock, the physical features of the landscape, the form of animals and man, that sort of thing. So there's these two components to this life. The first is motion and action, and we associate life with motion. We've talked about this recently, but think about all the motion that's going on. Atoms are vibrating. There's molecular motion. There's electrons moving around. There's chemical reactions. There's changes in pressure and changes in time, and the actions of the cells in my body, and the macroorganism itself, and the spinning of the planets and the sun and the galaxies. Everything is motion, right? All that motion is associated with life, and that life comes from God. That's the first part. The second part is something that causes the permanency of structure and form. Now, this is interesting. This is how the logos is described by the ancient Greeks. It's the thing that's associated with form and order. And so you have, in the sort of Jordan Petersonian sense, you have chaos and order, and you need them both. And God is made up of these things, chaos and order, the motion, the creation, the creative, moving component, the transforming component. And then you have that which gives the chaos order, which gives the structure to being, which makes the potential actual. And he says this invisible life was also conceived as being similar to the willpower in which man is conscious within himself. So again, this is like human beings are made in the image of God. Well, what does that mean? The Omaha are saying it has to do with the power of the will. It has to do with something like consciousness. But more than that, it's the power of consciousness to direct action, to create, essentially. That's what we share with God. And he calls this a power by which things are brought to pass. So it's kind of like this idea of the logos being within every human being. It's like the breath of God that's breathed into Adam, or the Spirit of God, this holiness that the Omaha believe it comes from God, that's in everything. And it's called Wakan. It's the divine is in everything. And that certainly includes human beings. And we can demonstrate that, exercise the thing that we have that's godlike. This is our consciousness and our will, our our ability to decide and to act and to move and to discriminate, for that matter. He says, through this mysterious life, all things are related to one another. The seen to the unseen, the dead to the living, the fragment of anything to its entirety. This invisible life and power was called Wakanda. Man, the hair stands up on my arms. So I want to hone in on this for just a second. He says, through this mysterious life, all things are related to one another. So what you see here is echoes of this divine unity, this idea of oneness that mystics talk about all throughout time. And I believe that to be the origin of religion and spirituality. So it just doesn't surprise me to see this here. Through this mysterious life, through God, all things are related to one another. So you have something like an allusion to the divine unity. All things are in the mind of God, remember? So all things are God. He says, human conditions were projected upon nature. And this is no surprise. We see this all the time. It's not unique to the Native Americans, but like in ancient Greece, for instance, we see deities that represent nature, like let's say the god Pan or something. And Pan acts a certain way and has a certain personality and has certain qualities. And those are qualities that we identify with natural phenomena. So it's a way for us to turn nature into a story, into a person with a story. So human conditions are projected onto nature by the Omaha. But specifically, he says, male and female forces are recognized. And this is highly emphasized among the Omaha. And listen to how he describes this. He says, the above was regarded as masculine, the below feminine. So the sky was father, the mother, or the earth was mother. The heavenly bodies were conceived as having sex. The sun was masculine, the moon feminine. Consequently, day is male and night female. But listen to this. The union of these two forces was regarded as necessary to the perpetuation of all living forms. The union of these forces, the union of opposites, the union of masculine and feminine, right? This is the most ancient religious symbol we constantly come back to. This is the idea of the Ouroboros. In ancient Babylon, in some of our earliest myths, it was Tiamat and Apsu, the great god, the great goddess, the fresh water, the salt water. There were always opposites in union. Uranus and Gaia, heaven and earth, Kronos and Rhea, Zeus and Hera. There's always this division into opposites. And we see this in the East as the yin and the yang. It's the same concept over and over again. But it's mystical. It's very mystical, because to understand opposites is no problem at all. But to understand them as one thing is a head scratcher. That's one of those things that it's not natural to intuit. But the union of opposites is something. It's something of ultimate importance. It's the thing without which there is no life, there is no form, according to the Omaha. The union of male and female, masculine and feminine. So when people think about taking a positive 5 and taking a negative 5 and merging them together, you have nothing. You're left with nothing, right? If you take hot and you take cold and you put them together, you're left with nothing. They sort of cancel each other out. This is the way we think about opposites. But the truth is something different. The mystical truth is something very different. It's that when those opposites seem to cancel each other out, what is left is not nothing. If you want to call it nothing, fine, but you have to have a different understanding of what that nothing means. That nothingness you're talking about is the potential for anything to be. The union of opposites isn't nothing, but it does seem like nothing. And the greatest example I can give you is if you can imagine putting everything that exists together, all opposites in union, all colors of the rainbow. You put them together, and what you end up with is white light that seems to have no color to it. So this is what I mean. When you put all the colors together, you have all of the potential for color. But what you seem to have is no color at all. So this is a subtle thing. This is one of those mystical pieces of wisdom. The union of opposites is something like God. And it may seem like nothing, but it is pregnant potentiality. It is the greatest of all possible things. All right, that brings me to a different source that I want to talk about. This one goes back to the 1800s. It's one of those ethnologists I was telling you about that would travel, out west and meet these tribes and try to record their religion and culture before they were gone, basically. This book is called The Religion of the Omahas and Ponkas by Reverend J. Owen Dorsey. Again, just an ethnologist from the middle of the 1800s. And he says this. He says, the idea of a supreme being is said to have existed among the Omahas prior to the coming of civilization. Remember, this was written in the mid-1800s. What he means by that is prior to white people coming into contact with them. So they had this idea of a supreme being, a high God. It's semantics to say that they're not monotheism as far as I'm concerned. So Dorsey says the writer, so he's talking about himself, heard this not only from Joseph LaFlèche, so now he's referencing the guy that wrote the book we were just talking about, who was himself an Omaha Indian, but also from men still holding their ancestral faith. So he's talking about native people that still worship in the way their ancestors did. He said one of these, whose name was Two Crows, is now one of the head men of his tribe. So he's basically trying to say, this is legit what I'm going to tell you. This is coming from the chief of the tribe. This is coming from the natives themselves, not from commentators or white people. He says, the ancestors of the Omahas believed that there was a supreme being, whom they called Wakanda. They believed that Wakanda existed, but did not undertake to say how he existed. Let me just stop on that. So the Omaha believed God existed, but wouldn't say a word about how God existed. So you might wonder about that. A lot of people are telling all kinds of stories about God, so you can understand what God is to the best of your ability. But the truth is, the word God is an unknowable concept. It stands in for an unknowable concept. God is something infinite, and something infinite is not something we can wrap our brains around, right? Every time you try to capture it so that you can get your grips of what this means, it's infinite, baby. It just continues to go. You can never wrangle it all in. And that's why God is noetic. That's why religion, and especially mystical experience, is very difficult to communicate to people. So this is their way of saying God is beyond concepts. God is unknowable. He says, there was no general assembly for the purpose of worshiping or praying to him. Each person thought in his heart that Wakanda existed. Some addressed the sun as Wakanda, though many did not. Some worshiped the thunder under this name. This was especially the case when men undertook to go on the war path. So you see here how we have a little bit of an enlightenment of what we were talking about earlier with the Dakota and having this sort of hierarchy. He said some people think about the sun as God, but it's only like a half truth. It's only like a representation. It's only like something to point to, because in other instances it's the thunder, right? So it's like all of nature is God, and you can point to any one phenomena and still be talking about the whole, all of nature and in existence. He said prayer to Wakanda was not made for small matters, but only for great and important undertakings, such as going to war or going on a journey. And the places for prayer are rocks, mountains, and high cliffs. Okay, so there's a bunch of interesting stuff here. Firstly, the idea that nobody worships Wakanda, nobody worships this high spirit, and they're not even really taught about the high spirit. Everybody just sort of seems to know intuitively. They just sort of catch on that, there's this high God thing we don't talk about, we don't offer worship to. There's this similar idea that we see in sub-Saharan Africa. I was trying to think about what this Latin name was in another podcast, and I'm probably going to struggle again. I think it's like Deus abscondis, something like that. The God who isn't there, right? That's how these sub-Saharan African tribes see the Great Spirit. That they have, in many cases, a high God, just like we're describing here with Wakanda. But nobody worships him. He's considered so transcendent that you can't offer prayers to him. Everything belongs to him already. What are you offering to him? There's no rituals surrounding that. There's no prayers you're going to give to him. He already knows your heart. Everything you say, he already knows. And he's not seen as something you can barter with. Like, I'm not going to sacrifice to the high God and in exchange get something. It's like, what can I do for the high God? He already has everything, including me. You see what I mean? So there's this high God idea that makes worship superfluous, and that's what we see with the Omaha. That's what they're trying to describe. And then he makes a bunch of other interesting points. He says that they don't worship ancestors. He says they don't have any idea of demons or devils. And his words are, they never had any idea of a bad spirit till they met the white man. Now they have adopted the term Wakande Payaji, which is the bad Wakandi, the devil, or Wanakse Paija, which means the bad spirit. I know I'm mispronouncing that, but so the idea here is that before the white man introduced the idea of the devil and demons, their idea of God was a unitive idea. The monad, right? God is everything. That includes what we would distinguish good and evil, but it's the whole kit and caboodle. They didn't separate those ideas. And I think that's very interesting. That has to do with an emphasis on the unity. And it's so much that there's an inability to distinguish. It's like you're not going to take something away from God because God is everything. And if that thing is evil, if you don't like that thing, pretending it's not a part of God is a non-starter because God is everything. And then you might expect that tribal people worship idols or they have fetishes, is the word that the ethnologists and anthropologists use. And he says that that's not the case with the Omaha. He says inanimate objects are not worshipped, though there are some who consider as sacred the skins of animals and the feathers of such birds as are used for their sacred bags. Then he says something interesting here. He says, each person has a wanajihi, or spirit, which does not perish at death. They were told by the old men, quote, if you are good, you will go to the good ghosts. If you are bad, you'll go to the bad ghosts. So nothing was said about going to dwell with Wakande or with demons. And Frank LaFresh heard some of the old men tell the tradition that years ago, a man had come back to life and told about the spirit land. So this is like a near-death experience type scenario. And that person said, for 4 nights after you die, your ghost has to travel a very dark road. But after that, he reaches the Milky Way, where there's plenty of light. So this is interesting because it's related to mystical experiences. There are certain ways where you can access the unconscious or the spirit realm or whatever it is that you want to call it. And many of those ways are, religious. So there are ecstatic rituals, there's psychedelic drugs, there's all kinds of different things that people do to access this part of our experience that we don't ordinarily have access to. And near-death experiences are very similar. And so this is what he's describing. It's something considered to be legitimate, like legitimate knowledge of what happens after you die. There's no pushback against this because these people all believe in the spirit world and Wakande and all of this. He says, after going along the Milky Way, the ghost came at last to a place where the road forked, and there sat an aged man, clothed in a buffalo robe. So now I'm just imagining St. Peter at the pearly gates, right? He said nothing but pointed to each inquirer the road for which he asked. One road was a very short one, and he who followed it soon came to the place where the good ghosts dwelt. The other road was an endless one, along with which the ghosts went crying. The spirits of suicides could not travel either road. So I think that's interesting. The fact that suicide is considered a mortal sin in Christianity, and the Omaha are saying, when you get to the pearly gates, when you get to this point in the afterlife where you're going to go to your ultimate destination, if you committed suicide, you don't get to go to either place, right? So that has reminiscent of something like purgatory or something, right? All right, then he gets to a bit about fasting, and this is where I think it gets interesting, because fasting, again, is associated with mystical experience. It's one of the paths that people take to have an altered state of consciousness that connects them to, again, that part of our experience we don't ordinarily have access to, that part of our experience that people call unconscious or spiritual. And he says this: La Flèche and Two Crows heard the following spoken of as an ancient custom. So this is two Omaha tribesmen telling the La Flèche here about what the tribe used to do in the old days. He says, it was told them in their youth by some of the old men who had received it from their elders, as having been practiced by the tribe from time immemorial. When old men had sons, nephews, or grandsons who approached manhood, they used to command these youths to fast and put clay on their faces, saying, quote, walk ye in remote places crying to Wakanda, neither eat nor drink for 4 days. Even though you are Kube, which means sacred, Wakanda will aid you. If you act as poor men and pray as you cry, he will help you. Many thought that this fasting enabled them to have supernatural communication with Wakanda. In modern times, it has fallen into disuse. All right, so there's this age-old custom when the boys are coming of age, that they are sent out to remote places. They're sent out into the wilderness, and they're told to pray to God and not to eat or drink for 4 days. And that this is supposed to bring them to a communion with God. This is supposed to bring them into communication with the divine. This is specifically a path to a mystical experience. This is something they wanted all of their children to have. They wanted them to have this personal experience of God. This is the mystical experience. This is that rare thing which today, and perhaps through most of certainly Western history, is rare. Not everybody has one. Some people live their whole lives and never have one. And this is something they wanted all of their 12-year-old boys to do. It's like, look, you're going to face something very difficult. This is an initiation ceremony. There are all sorts of them. They're very important culturally. We're going to have this initiation. But what it is for the Omaha is to send these children out into the forest with nothing to eat or drink. And they're just waiting for their exhaustion and starvation to bring them a vision of God. It's amazing. All right, so that brings me to a modern fella. His name is Fred Weeks. He's a grand elder of the Omaha, and he publishes this piece called the Omaha Tribal Prayer. And I just want to read it to you because it's connected to this fasting idea that we just encountered. He says, according to the Omaha idea, a child during its infancy has no existence as an individual member of the tribe, but remained as a part of its parents. So I just want to say for a second, this isn't uncommon either. It used to be even in the West. We wouldn't name our children right away because there was so much infant mortality. We didn't want to become attached to them, and so we didn't see them as quite human until enough time had passed for them to have basically received their soul, for lack of a better phrase. And this is what we see here. During infancy, the child is considered a part of its parents. It's not an individual, right? And then he goes on, he says, when it could walk alone, right? When it could stand on its own, it was initiated into the tribe through certain religious rites. A distinct personal experience acquired in the rite brought him into direct communication with the supernatural powers. This is what I want to emphasize again. It is a distinct personal experience of God. That is what mysticism is. It is about your relationship and experience to the divine, your connection to it, your understanding of it. It is something that is unique to you. It doesn't happen to more than one person. It happens only to you individually. This is the root of all organized religion. It all stems from somebody's story of having actually encountered God or become God or whatever, however you want to frame it. And that's specifically what this rite is about. You aren't going to become grown. You're not going to be a member of the tribe officially until you've spoken to God, until you've seen the truth of it for your own eyes. He says, in preparation for this rite, the Omaha youth was taught the tribal prayer. He was to sing it during the 4 nights and days of his vigil in some lonely place. As he left his home, his parents put clay on his head, and to teach him self-control, they placed a bow and arrow in his hand, with the instruction not to use them during his long fast, no matter how great the temptation might be. He was bidden to weep as he sang the prayer, and to wipe his tears on the palm of his hands, to lift his wet hands to heaven, and then lay them on the earth. With these instructions, the youth departed to enter upon the trial. When at last he fell into sleep or trance, and the vision came, bringing with it a cadence. This song became ever after the medium of communication between the man and the mysterious power. And by it, he summoned help and strength in the hour of his need. In this manner, all mysterious songs originated. The songs sung when healing plants were gathered, when the medicine was administered, when a man set his traps or hunted for game, when he desired to look into the future or sought supernatural guidance or deliverance from impending danger. So what he's saying here is, when these kids have gone out into the wilderness and they've starved to the point of have visionary experience, they're singing this prayer that they're taught, kind of like a mantra through this experience. And in the experience, they hear a song, and it seems to be unique for everyone. Every person's vision comes with a song that they receive from God, like a divine song, and then they sing their tribal prayer to their own unique tune. And this is the origin of all of the tribal songs they sing when they're trying to bless a hunt or trying to heal someone sick, and they're singing their songs. All of those songs came from a personal, mystical, visionary experience. In that prayer, in English, it reads, "Father Spirit, a needy one stands before you. It is I, he that sings. Great Spirit, guide us, protect us." And that brings me to my conclusion. Wakonda, the Great Spirit of the Omaha, was first presented to me in a book we recently covered on the podcast, Wetzel's The Origin of the World's Mythologies. This was only a brief reference, but it made an impression on me. It was the opening of their creation myth, which reads, "At the beginning, all things were in the mind of Wakonda." I couldn't believe my eyes. Here was a mythology labeled primitive by the ethnologists, and yet in it reflects a staggeringly sophisticated idea. This idea says that the nothingness, which existed before the cosmos, was as far from nothing as can be imagined. This thing the Greeks called chaos and the Babylonians Tiamat, this thing Eastern philosophy calls a non-being or Tao, is captured perfectly in the Omaha understanding of Wakonda. It is potentiality itself, eternal, living, and thinking, the mind of God. This idea isn't mysterious because it proposes a single origin for all things material and spiritual, a kind of tribal monotheism. A book titled Primitive Revelation by Wilhelm Schmidt demonstrates conclusively that the Great Spirit motif among native peoples of the Americas absolutely does constitute a supreme being. What makes Wakonda so mysterious is its connection to mind. This is not a mind, and it's not attached to any body. It is the mind at large. It's a disembodied, eternal process of thinking, a cosmic consciousness. It brings to mind the pre-Socratics and Platonic notion of nous, the world of forms, the mind of God. It reminds me of Walter Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, Spinoza and the Advaita school of Hinduism, to say nothing of the panpsychists, idealists, and pantheist philosophies, which also fall into this domain. This idea of God as mind clearly ties together our seeking to understand God across time and space and culture. Where my mind really gravitates, however, is toward those mystical elements of Omaha religion. Firstly, we see that personal visionary experience at its heart. This is reflected in the coming-of-age initiation ceremony, where the male children are sent away in the wilderness to fast in solitude for days on end until they receive a vision and enter into communion with the divine. Now, this type of altered state of consciousness is absolutely central to mystical experience, and by extension, organized religion itself. Next, we're told that the life of God exists in all things. This spirit, or wanajihi, I don't know how you say it, forgive me, or our divine component, Wakan, it's inherited by us from our source. It fills us and gives us life. It is imbued within all of nature and all of reality. I can't help but think here of the biblical Ruach Adonai, the Spirit of God, that was breathed into Adam, and the Spirit of God which moved on the surface of creation. These two show God in all things. And lastly, there is this emphasis on the symbol of opposites in union, which the Omaha understand as the operation of Wakonda, what God does. It is that which preserves and sustains the material cosmos. Omaha speak of the counterdependence of above and below, sky and earth, sun and moon, day and night, as expressions of the masculine and feminine, very like the Taoist yin and yang. They understand these components to be something like a divine unity, symbolizing some great truth about the nature of God and the world. The Omaha cut to the very heart of what the Ouroboros means. They call this unity Wakonda and state that it is, quote, necessary for the perpetuation of life. How perfectly mystical. All right, so to end, I'm going to try to recite the Omaha tribal prayer in the Omaha language for you. Here it goes. Wakande Thethu Wapethon Athone.
Well, there you have it. That's one evidence.